underneath me.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kelly Mylink, a partner in our Husch Blackwell's immigration group. Before we begin, they make us cover a few housekeeping items. So at the bottom of your audience console, there are multiple application icons for you to use during the program today. If you have any questions during the webcast, please submit those via the question box, which is also one of your icons below. We'll try to answer all of those questions during the webcast today, but if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, we can answer that later via email. A PDF of the presentation is available in the resources folder. The program itself has been approved for HR and legal education hours. So to report your hours, you'll click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of this webcast for watching and sharing. Toward the end of the program, make sure you complete our short survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs that are kind of applicable to your business needs. So if you've got a particular program in mind that you're interested in, that's a great way to let us know. So I think that's it for our housekeeping items, and we'll get started with our program. Today, we're going to be providing an update on the H-1B Visa lottery for 2021, and we're going to talk more about H-1B Visa sponsorship. And I'm joined today by my partner, Christine Fabian.
Thank you, Kelly, and hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I do not know what the weather is like where you are at, but Kelly and I are in Kansas City, aka the tundra of Siberia. It's so cold. There are also rolling blackouts that are happening. So if at any point we cease to exist, it's probably because we've lost power. So we're going to try to really power through this, no pun intended, to get you guys your CLE credit and make sure that we have given you all of the information that we think is important for you to know. So really quick, we're going to go over a few topics. Kelly's going to start us off by talking to us about the H-1B Visa lottery and the H-1B cap, what our expectations are for this year. And then I'll talk a bit about considerations, things to think about as an employer when you are sponsoring foreign national workers. We'll also touch base on recent changes that have happened in immigration, and then also kind of give you a crystal ball of things that we're expecting this upcoming year with the new administration. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Kelly so that she can talk us through an overview of the H-1B visa and the H-1B cap.
Thank you. Okay, so let's get started. Before we really get into the meat of the presentation, we always start these webinars kind of going back through and resetting what is an actual H-1B visa. I know some of you are very familiar with it. You've got it down. Others of you, you're just kind of learning and starting this process, or you're just here to learn. So it's good to kind of take a step back and talk about what the H-1B visa is. So it is employer-sponsored work authorization for professionals. So it's meant for a professional level position, and it's employer-sponsored, meaning that there has to be that employer-employee relationship. Essentially, this means that if you have somebody who comes to the United States, sets up their own shop, they're a business owner, they can't self-sponsor. Generally, they can't self-sponsor their H-1B petition. There really needs to be an employer or a controlling entity that's controlling their employment. Second, the offered position has to be in a specialty occupation. That's kind of the professional part of this. And what that means is a very complex definition that, a specialty occupation is an occupation that requires the theoretical and practical knowledge of a body of highly specialized knowledge and attainment of a bachelor's or higher degree or the equivalent in a specific specialty. That's a lot of words to just say, The position itself has to require a bachelor's degree or the equivalent of a bachelor's degree in a specific special field. And in addition to that, really the occupation where that position fits into needs to also generally require a degree in a specific field. So mechanical engineers going to require a mechanical engineering degree. It's a specialty occupation. But if I am hiring and going to sponsor a legal assistant for for an H-1B, and we say I'm going to require a degree in business to be my legal assistant, it might be that that's not going to qualify because not all legal assistants really require a bachelor's degree, and that just might be my preference. But it's going to be very difficult for us to prove that this is an occupation that really requires a degree in a specific field of study. Additionally, the employee must possess appropriate academic credentials or the equivalent. Meaning if it's a mechanical engineer, you're requiring a mechanical engineering degree, that person better have that mechanical engineering degree. And then some occupations, you have state licensure, which is also required. So doctors, obviously lawyers, and certain other professions where it's normal that they would possess that state licensure, they're going to need that as well as part of their own academic credentials or qualifications. Christine's going to hit on more of the employer part of this in a minute, but I wanted to go over sort of the basics of the H-1B, but we'll get into employer sponsorship here in a few minutes. The H-1B visa itself is sort of strange because there's only a limited number of visas available each year. So each year, there is 85,000 new H-1B visas available. This means that this is new coming into, going out into the world. It doesn't mean that, every year somebody has to apply for a new one. It's just for somebody who's never applied for an H-1B visa before or never had one before, they are going to have to look and seek one of these 85,000 visas that are available. The fiscal year starts October 1. Because the government runs the government fiscal year runs October 1 to September 30th. 20,000 of those 85 are reserved for those holding a U.S. master's degree or higher from a U.S. institution of higher education. So there are a preference given if you have attended school here in the United States and obtained a master's degree or a PhD or some sort of higher education. The problem with the H-1B visas being limited is that demand far exceeds supply. So generally, the plan is for the government to just, issue H-1, on a rolling basis, review petitions, and then once they run out, then they would run out for that year until October 1. What has happened is that year after year, demand has so exceeded supply that the government said, you know what? We're going to have to look at this initially because we're getting far too many applications or petitions submitted as the earliest possible date. So we need to conduct a computer-generated lottery, a random computer-generated lottery, to determine which individuals and which companies will get to sponsor these individuals for an H-1B visa. Currently, I think last year, and Christine, correct me if I'm wrong, we're sitting right at around 200,000 H-1B or petitions submitted each year for the 85,000. Is that right?
Yeah, I think even a bit more than that. I think we were close to 300,000 last year.
So, the demand is really high, and your chances of getting an H-1B are not great. They're not comfortable if you're an employer looking to start this process for an employee. And again, the good news is that those with the U.S. master's degree have sort of a certain set that's reserved for them. And then they're also included in a lottery for the remaining 65,000. So the beauty of having a U.S. master's degree or higher is that individual will get sort of two shots at the lottery because they are included in that 20,000 and then also included in the remaining lottery for the 65,000. So let's talk a little bit about what that H-1B registration process looks like, the H-1B lottery process. So it used to be when we would file for the lottery, we would have every employer would file their H-1B petition on the earliest possible date, which is 6 months before that October 1 date when those visas become available. So roughly April 1, all of the employers would submit their petitions and the whole thing. They'd submit filing fees, all of the documents that go into the H-1B petition to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. That is a lot of petitions for the government to log and then conduct that random lottery. So what they said last year was, you know what, we need a new process for this. We still need to conduct this lottery, but how do we do it in a way that we don't have to deal with all this paperwork? Is there a way that we can make this a little bit easier? And what happened was the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS, developed this registration process. The registration process essentially allows employers to electronically submit a registration for the lottery, which is basic information about their company and the employee being sponsored. That information gets submitted online and then cataloged for the random lottery process. Then, once all of that information is collected from all the employers, then USCIS says, okay, now we will do the lottery from these registrations. And at that point, once you know you're selected, then you can submit an H-1B petition to USCIS. Essentially, kind of saying, okay, employers, you don't have to fill out the entire thing just to enter the lottery on behalf of your employee. You can submit the information online, basic information, and then if you're selected, then put everything together for the H-1B petition and submit it in the lottery, or submit it for consideration. So we kind of doing a little flow chart of the way this works to hopefully lay it out a little bit easier. But what is happening with this registration process is that employers and their representatives, if you have an immigration attorney helping you, will create an account with USCIS and enter that registration information for the lottery. They will pay a $10 fee per registrant. And then and I guess you can't even create the registration information until March 9th, but you are submitting that registration information from March 9th to March 25th this year. And in fact, you can't even log in to create that information until March 9th. You can create that account and set it up, but you can't create and submit that registration until March 9th. It'll close on March 25th, and then USCIS has told us they're going to conduct the lottery on or before March 31. If you are selected, the employers are notified via email, but you can also log back into that account and figure out that you've been selected in that lottery process. And at that point, you can file the H-1B petition within 90 days of the selection. The H-1B petition itself, we'll get into some of the components of that. And then government will issue a decision on the H-1B petition. If it's regular processing, it can take 6 to 9 months, sometimes longer to get a decision. The processing times are incredibly long. In some cases, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services allows employers to expedite that and get a decision within 2 weeks' time. That premium processing option is going to cost employers another $2,500. It's an expensive process. The H-1B registration requirements themselves are actually quite simple. So when you're filling out that online form, it doesn't ask for a whole lot of information from employers and employees. And that information generally is listed on this slide. And then there's a picture of what the registration website looks like. It's called My USCIS, and the website is my.uscis.gov. I always think it's funny because, and I don't know if you can see on your screen because my screen's kind of small, but at the bottom of this website, it says, My USCIS makes immigration simpler. And it doesn't. The registration process, I always feel, is it doesn't require a lot of information. If you look on the screen, but it's deceptively simple, because when we go back to this flow chart, having to go through all of these steps is still a lot for employers to wrap their heads around. So in theory, I like the registration because it doesn't require a whole lot of information from the employers and the employee to actually register for the lottery. But the steps involved of having to register, completing the information, making sure you get it completed within March 9th to 25th, and then getting everything together within 90 days to then submit the H-1B petition is quite long. So it's a lot of steps involved, even if there's not a whole lot of information required at the outset. Before I get into the H-1B petition process, I just want to talk about a few reminders of the H-1B lottery process, because we get a lot of questions about this. Things like employers will ask me, well, can I just submit? It's only $10. So can I submit a registration on behalf of my employee 5 times in this lottery process? And the answer is no. There cannot be any duplicates by the same employer, or else USCIS will catch that and deny all of them. Sometimes employers will ask, well, hey, I've got a subsidiary over here, and the employee could work at the subsidiary and the parent, or the parent, so we'll just have this LLC file a registration and this subsidiary file a registration. And there's a lot of rules about duplications. If the employer is trying to essentially scam the system and submit 2 registrations and use multiple corporate entities within the same organization to submit duplicate registrations, then USCIS will deny it. But the rule is that there has to be a legitimate reason for multiple petitions on behalf of the same beneficiary. And that legitimate reason cannot be more chances in the lottery. But a real legitimate business reason, meaning you actually have 2 spots open, one at the subsidiary and one at the parent. And honestly, if you're asking us, don't do it. It's not worth the risk. But certainly there is a provision for that and a lot of debate about how to go about that. Because there's a lot of risk to doing so. And we get that question quite often. Another question we get is, you know what, we really want to sponsor this employee. They're getting their master's degree in May, but registration is happening in March. Can I submit a petition for them in the master's cap, or for that 20,000 H-1Bs available for individuals with U.S. master's degree? And the answer is yes, but you'll have to prove at the time that the H-1B petition is actually submitted that the individual employee had their master's degree and did in fact get it in May. So technically, yes, but you better be very, very sure that it's not going to take another semester for that employee to get their master's degree. Okay, so those are just some of the frequently asked questions that we get on that process. Finally, in terms of just thinking about the overall H-1B visa, I just want to talk a little bit about the H-1B petition process itself. So let's say that you submitted a registration on behalf of an employee. That employee received and were selected in the lottery. And then what happens? Then you get 90 days to file that H-1B petition itself. There are several steps to that process as well. Remember, I said that, the MyUSCIS may seem to make things simpler, but things are always more complicated. The H-1B petition process itself can be a little bit complicated as well. It requires a labor condition application, which is a preliminary wage filing. It requires workplace postings. It requires documentation, the employer to put together documentation related to the wage and working conditions. The second thing that it requires is to prepare and file the actual petition with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. That's filled out on Form I-129. And then at the end of it, as you know, as we discussed, USCIS can approve, deny, or they can say, you know what, you're not done yet. We need more evidence to show that you and the company, the position, and the person qualify for that H-1B visa. So that was a 20-minute, really fast overview of this process. Let's just take a quick step back and answer a poll question. How comfortable are you with the H-1B visa process? Maybe we should have asked this before I went into a 20-minute spiel. Are you a pro? Are you comfortable enough? Or you have absolutely no idea what you're doing? I will tell you that sometimes I have absolutely no clue what I'm doing. I'm kidding, but there are some questions that are just very, that even stump us as immigration attorneys. All right. Well, I am glad to see that there are some pros in the audience, some of you feel pretty comfortable, a little hesitancy there, and quite a number of you are really new to this process. So hopefully we can clarify a few more questions as we continue. So Christine, why don't you talk about the employer requirements?
Sure, happy to. And also, as questions come up, please feel free to send them to us in the little Q&A box. We would love for this to be a discussion instead of, us talking to you. So really, as things do come up, feel free to pipe up and let us know what questions you have. So before I jump into it, for those of you who attended the labor and employment presentation in the fall, I made reference to Ella Catherine Mylink, who recently joined the immigration team. And so I just wanted to update you guys with a new photo of her. She is now 4 months old. And is like the cutest baby in the world. So anyway, that's Ella Catherine Mylink. If you know Kelly, make sure you reach out and say congrats. She's a joy. So jumping into it, I often tell my clients, and if you work with me, I'm a really bad salesperson because I'm actively trying to talk my clients out of doing H-1Bs. Primarily because there's just a lot to be considered that I don't think most employers are aware of. It's a tremendous amount of time. It's a big investment. It's a lot of money, and there's a lot of emotion involved with these visas oftentimes. So unless you're really prepared to invest in that way, really think twice about whether or not going down the path of H-1B sponsorship is something that is right for you and your organization. So a couple of the key things. So employer obligations, I always start with the prevailing wage. And I start with the prevailing wage because oftentimes my employers just don't know that the wage is governed by the U.S. Department of Labor for foreign nationals who want to work with an employer on an H-1B visa, which means, ideally, if there is an H-1B individual that you're interested in sponsoring, call us before you make the offer or you decide or make promises that you're going to be sponsoring this individual. Because, for example, if you have a software engineer that you're paying, $60,000 a year to, and your software engineer is based in Houston, Texas, it's likely that the Department of Labor's wage for that software engineer in that metropolitan area is going to be higher. And we as employers have the obligation to pay them that higher wage for the duration of their H-1B visa. So just FYI, heads up on the prevailing wage. Also, in terms of employer obligations, you have to be aware that because an H-1B visa is employer sponsored, we're responsible as the employer for the vast majority of the costs involved with the H-1B. There are some exceptions and things that we can do and repayment agreements that we can draft, but for the most part, most of the fees are going to be coming out of your pocket. So if you have a foreign national that says, hey, but I'll pay for it myself, more often than not, they can't because we wouldn't be in compliance, and that would be in direct opposition to what the regulations say. Another kind of weird thing is that employers are responsible for paying the return ticket home for a foreign national, specifically in H-1B, should the employer decide that they are going to terminate them or otherwise decide not to renew their visa. So, just all of these kind of weird, wonky, one-off things that you've really got to consider and pay attention to should you decide you want to proceed. A couple other things. Working from home, especially in this new era of COVID, has been something that we've spent a lot of time talking about and thinking about. The thing with H-1B visas that you have to remember is that they're location specific. So in the event that, your organization decides everyone can work from home and you have an employee who's a foreign national and whose work site is listed on the H-1B petition as headquarters, which in this situation, let's just say that's Kansas City, Missouri. And the employee is like, oh, great, I can work from home. I don't want to be in Kansas City where there's lots of snow and it's negative 20 degrees outside. I'm going to move to Florida. That would put us as an organization in a pickle, in that we would need to decide whether or not to amend our H-1B. And this is something that recently immigration has really taken issue with. We've seen this uptick with immigration looking at the addresses of foreign nationals to make sure that they correspond with the addresses of the worksite location. So another thing kind of just to keep in mind and to talk to Immigration Counsel about should you decide that you want to proceed with sponsoring foreign nationals. And then also the H-1B visa is kind of a gateway visa. Ultimately, the vast majority of the foreign nationals that you're going to sponsor for an H-1B are going to want you to pursue a permanent residence case for them. So again, when considering whether or not to pursue immigration sponsorship for employees, it's really important to think about the long-term plan and what you want your investment to be long-term, particularly if you have foreign nationals that are from countries like India or China, where there's a really long backlog in green cards, and where it's likely that you'll have to continue investing in sponsorship over the course of, 15, 20 years. And then I guess finally, if your organization has not traditionally done a lot of visa sponsorships, and you're thinking about, expanding the candidates that are applying to jobs and, maybe taking on visa sponsorship as, a newer thing, I would really encourage you all at the front end to really think about maybe drafting an immigration policy that helps kind of draw guidelines for the parameters of what the organization is willing to take on in terms of investment. And then also provides, a certain element of consistency should you decide that, we're going to be hiring multiple foreign nationals in the future. So I know that was an earful. Please, again, if you have questions, shoot them in the Q&A box and we will do our best to answer them. But with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kelly. Oh, wait, no, I lied. I've got one more slide.
Well, Christine, I actually want to talk. Ha.
Oh, yeah. Go.
Yeah, I do. No, so I love the point about having the immigration sponsorship policy because it's so important to have a consistent immigration sponsorship policy. I'd add too that one thing that I know that we've both gotten a lot of questions about is should you include language in your offer letter when you're making an offer to a candidate who might require sponsorship? And yeah, I think that's a great idea. It's a place where you can also reference that immigration sponsorship policy or include that policy with your offer letter to let them know, look, this is our policy. Your offer is going to be contingent upon your ability to obtain work authorization. We're going to sponsor you, but we can't guarantee that sponsorship either. So certain things that you can put in that offer letter, including referring back to the immigration policy.
Great point. Thank you, Kelly. So one final thing that I wanted to mention, travel is always kind of an issue. Our employees who are foreign nationals always want to travel. With the change of status, likely from F1, which is student, to H1B, maybe sometimes TN, other type of immigrant visas to H1B. When that change of status is pending, for the most part, generally speaking, employees should not travel. In the event that they do travel while that change of status is pending, they essentially abandon the application. So even pre-COVID, it was always kind of, our song and dance that we would encourage, advise employers to really stress with their employees that they can't go anywhere while the change of status is pending. Now that we have COVID, it's like the can of worms have opened. And for the most part, I'll be totally honest with you, Kelly and I are advising pretty generally as, just a matter of practice these days that employees should refrain from traveling unless it's really an absolute emergency. And part of the reason for that is that the consulates have just all been closed or are just really limited in the processing that they're taking on abroad. And as part of the Trump administration's push to, keep people at bay in their home countries, there was a presidential proclamation that suspended the issuance of visas, which means that, so I guess backtracking, in immigration, we work with all of these different agencies that all have jurisdiction over different parts of the visa process. So when a foreign national is in the US, we're working with the Department of Homeland Security, and they issue the physical approval. However, as soon as that foreign national leaves the US and steps foot in a country abroad, that little piece of paper that we got from the Department of Homeland Security no longer holds that same jurisdiction. And the foreign national actually has to go to the consulate and get like this stamp that goes into their passport, which allows them to travel back and forth. All that to be said, since COVID, one, foreign nationals just can't really get the stamps because the consulates are pretty much closed. And two, with this presidential proclamation, the proclamation essentially says if you're a foreign national who recently got an H-1B approval, we're not going to give you a stamp. There are exceptions to this, but the exceptions are few and far between. So just keep that in mind if you have foreign nationals that you currently employ or that you're looking to sponsor in the H-1B cap this year. So with that, I'm going to hand it back off to Kelly to chat with us a bit about changes to the H-1B program.
Thanks. Just to clarify, because I know a couple people had questions, Domestic travel is fine. This is international travel that we were talking about, but getting, flying from Kansas City to New York, you might have some trouble with the different states requirements about entry and exit, but generally the immigration issue is going to be when you travel outside the United States and come back. Okay, changes in the H-1B program. I have one slide on this and so much to talk about. And really, every time a new administration comes and takes the reins, we have a series of executive orders, we have rescission of prior executive orders, and, some of it is significant and some of it is just, all right, what, is this going to actually change the way we do things? And, whenever I talk about, we get the question a lot, like what's going to happen? And Christine's going to talk a little bit about that. But it's difficult to do the crystal ball. And that's, we'll wrap up today kind of talking about that. But right now I want to talk a little bit about what has happened. Which is basically a flurry of executive orders that does some things, but not all. I mean, immigration law is largely statutory, and so there's only so much that can be done by executive order, but some things are significant. So I'll start with last fall. It was last fall. We were starting to hear rumblings of this wage-based selection. And in fact, in November, it was that USCIS published this proposed rule that would modify the H-1B lottery process, that changed it from being just totally random to having a preference for those registrations where the employer is paying the highest wages. And if you're reading about H-1Bs, this is going to pop up in a lot of your Google searches. That proposed rule actually is being delayed by this administration. It will likely never be published, and will continue, and we are continuing, at least for this current year, that H-1B selection process is only for, will be random, with the exception of that those with a U.S. master's degree have a slight preference because some visas are reserved for them. And on the registration process, we'll probably have a few minutes for questions, but I know there was a few universities who had some questions in the Q&A. So I'll also mention that the lottery process in and of itself, that only applies to employers who are not cap exempt. So there are certain employers who do not and are not subject to that 85,000 limit. That includes institutions of higher education, government research organizations, and institutions affiliated with higher education institutions. So they can sponsor employees without regard to that 85,000 visa limit. But they still have to file the whole H-1B petition process. You're still petitioning for somebody, so it still requires putting that petition together. You just are not subject to that random lottery. There was a few other things that have happened in recent weeks. Buy American, Hire American, or BAHA as it was referred to, was rescinded. The Buy American, Hire American executive order had really two components. One was that federal agencies would have to buy products made in the United States. I mean, it was really steel, manufactured goods, that sort of thing. The other part of it was the rigorous enforcement of immigration laws. And the idea was, let's put some more restrictions on the ability of employers to sponsor foreign workers so that we can protect U.S. jobs. The end result of this was a series of other executive orders, or you'd see policy changes or provisions that were really meant to sort of impose some additional hurdles or ensure that visas, and particularly H-1B visas, were awarded to only the highly skilled and highest paid workers, which created some problems. we knew that this would, the policy changes included RFE or request for evidence rates. So we'd submit an H-1B petition, and where in previous years it would just be approved without issue, now we were getting a request for evidence. They think there was, in 2019, there are maybe 40% of H-1B petitions being submitted were getting a request for additional evidence, which is just more work on the employer part. That dropped a little in 2020, I think to about 30%. So, that is something that's was sort of a result, was the immigration officers really questioning whether the employers were certain aspects of the regulation. They were really drilling down on employers to provide a whole host of evidence and not really giving a lot of deference to employers in the process, which can be kind of frustrating as an employer to say, no, we do require a degree for this position, and then having to actually prove it with documentation is burdensome. The H-1B petition denial rates were pretty high. So if a request for evidence was issued, you'd see about 25 or 26% of those H-1B petitions being denied after the request for evidence was responded to. So that has been rescinded, and we'll sort of see if that trickles down or not into what happens this year when we file H-1B petitions under a new administration. There was a prevailing wage increase that came down last fall that luckily I got to avoid while I was on my maternity leave, and Christine and others in our office were handling calls after this came out. But essentially the Department of Labor came out this fall and said, you know what, we are raising all of the required wages for the H-1B program, for the permanent resident sponsorship, just in significant percentages. That was subject to a lot of litigation, of course. Ultimately, it's being delayed and will probably never be published. And our prevailing wage levels are back where they were prior to the proposed, that final rule coming into play. That it was about October that was happening. Finally, there's a couple more. So computer programmers, there was a computer programmer memo that was rescinded by the prior administration. So the Trump administration said, you know what, we're really going to take a hard look at computer programmers. And instead of saying that they are eligible for H-1B status, we are saying, you know what, it might be that there are most computer programmer occupations just aren't specialty occupations that qualify for an H-1B visa. And that they rescinded a memo that came down in 2000 that basically said, you know what, computer programmers could qualify for an H-1B visa because they do require that body of highly specialized knowledge. And then now we have the Biden administration revoking the memo that the Trump administration revoked. So if you can follow all of that, good luck to you. There is, and finally, there was a definition of the employer-employee relationship that came down as part of I believe it was the Strengthening the H-1B Non-Immigrant Visa Classification Program final rule as well. That really made it a little bit more stated that third-party placement situation. So where you had an employee who you as the employer placed at a client site, imposed a lot of restrictions on employers, a lot of burdens on employers to prove that you were still the employer of that employee. And the client site where the employee is being, or the employee might be sitting at their office or assisting on a project at that client site, that client is not also an employer as well. There was that, I mean, the repercussions of this particular rule would be that maybe that this is a joint employer situation where both the actual employer and the client would have to file that H-1B petition. But that rule has also been delayed and probably will never see publication. Okay, let's take another breather, and we have another poll question. And this one is a little getting into the weeds. So, do you believe the revocation of Buy American, Hire American will have a positive impact on the American workforce, or not? And this is not to get political. It's just it's an interesting executive order that came down with the prior administration, and it's really going to be interesting what the current administration does. Whether it's going to be incredibly drastic with the revocation of this executive order. A lot of you are undecided, and that's perfectly acceptable to feel that way, because we're still sort of seeing the repercussions of all of a new administration. But I'm not going to look into the crystal ball. I'm going to leave that to Christine to sort of make those predictions of what's going to happen with the new administration. So, Christine, why don't you tell us what you're thinking?
Thanks, Kelly. So there were a handful of questions that came through about computer programmers and where we're at today with computer programmers. I will tell you that I'm still really scared of computer programmers. I don't actually want to file a computer programmer yet. My guess is that there's a 50-50 chance. I think it's still relatively new, and so we don't really know in the aggregate how USCIS is treating them. I would probably stay away from filing them for the time being until we have kind of more information under our belt. But that's just me and my personal opinion. So Kelly, it wouldn't be a Christine and Kelly presentation unless I told you a joke, right? And for those of us for those of you that have not done a presentation with Kelly and I, like my only joy in the world is to see her kind of uncomfortable. So I just tell her awful jokes in front of hundreds of people because I like seeing her blush. So here's my joke for you. What's a polar bear's favorite food?
I don't think I've gotten a joke right this entire time that you've been at Husch Blackwell and that we've been doing these presentations. I don't know, Christine. I don't know.
Well, you and polar bears have more in common than you think. Burritos. Get it?
I get it.
All right. I try.
And very appropriate for this cold weather.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you for humoring me. All right. So the crystal ball. Again, if you work with me on a regular basis, you know that something I say very often is that practicing immigration is like working on the engine of a car, and the car is running, the ignition is on. Things change every single day. Something that could have been a pretty standard policy 2 days ago, overnight can switch. So I don't know. I mean, if you've been in the immigration world, you will know that the past 4 years have been pretty wild. It's definitely been a new frontier in navigating business immigration issues. The last administration definitely did not make our lives easy. My guess is that a lot of the policies and procedures that were put into place during the Trump administration are going to linger around for a while. If you've worked with government agencies, you know that they are old dinosaurs that take a long time to move and transition. So we've seen the Biden administration rescind a whole load of the executive orders that were put into motion, travel ban, other, wall building, different types of policies that don't necessarily affect us in the business world. The business world is actually pretty frustrated. As I mentioned in one of my other slides, the suspension of visa issuances that are happening abroad under an executive order that was a Trump executive order still hasn't been rescinded. We're waiting for the Biden administration to rescind that. But in all honesty, I think that things are going to stay kind of the same for a while. And the Biden administration just has a huge job ahead of them to kind of backtrack and try to undo some of the, intense regulations and policies that were put into place that affect our businesses and organizations. There's also been rumor about this new bill coming down the pipeline called the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021. In the business context, I think the way that it's going to affect us the most, there's talk about essentially clearing the visa backlog and eliminating the per country visa caps, which means that our individuals from countries like India and China, where there's just a really substantial wait, it will be less about issuing permanent residence cards per country and more about who is in line first. So those are kind of the two big things. I think there's a lot ahead of us, and I'm very curious to see what the Trump administration, the Biden administration pulls off. But yeah, we'll see. Fingers crossed. Kelly, is there anything else that I'm missing? Anything else you want to add?
No, I mean, with every administration, whenever there's a new executive order that makes some of these drastic changes, they get challenged. They're in the courts. So what is true yesterday in immigration seems to not be true the next day. So it's difficult. I'm always the one person who likes to make things easy for people. But this is just one thing that's just not easy because things are just constantly changing. And we talked about all the travel issues that people are having. But even as we have a new administration that issues their own executive orders, those could get challenged. So all sorts of things can happen in the future. It's tough.
Yeah. Well, all right. With that, if you asked questions that we were not able to get to, we will do our best to respond to them via email. The firm has a closing that they want me to read to you, so bear with me. So thank you again for joining us today. We hope the information was helpful to you and your organization. As a reminder, this program has been approved for HR and legal education hours. To report your hours, click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing, because we're that much fun and you're going to want to watch us twice. Be sure to complete our short survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your business needs. And seriously, if there is something that you want us to talk about that we have not talked about, let us know and we'll try to put something on the schedule. Otherwise, this concludes our webinar. Thank you all for attending and stay warm.